drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. Professor Joe Henrich, thank you for joining me.
Great to be with you.
You want to start off by just briefly introducing yourself and telling everyone a little bit about who you are?
Sure. I'm Joe Henrich. I'm a professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard University. I apply evolutionary theory to think about the human mind and the emergence of the human mind, and I'm particularly interested in how that process led to what we think of as culture and cultural evolution.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk a little bit about the origins of the human mind, but we'll largely talk about some of the changes that happened to human psychology in history that led up to and gave rise to what you call the Western mind, or your book's title is The Weirdest People in the World. And that acronym WEIRD means something in particular. Can you just sort of summarize concisely for everyone, what is weird psychology in the thesis of this book in a nutshell?
Sure. So the key thing to understand is that WEIRD is an acronym or a backronym that stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And it's really a kind of consciousness-raising device that my colleagues Steve Heine and Aaron Orenzian, two social psychologists at the University of British Columbia, came up with as a way of raising the consciousness of researchers and reminding them that the populations that they study, typically Americans, people from Western societies, at one time this was mostly university students, are unusual when placed in a global perspective, thinking about their psychological attributes. And we wrote this paper back in 2010, which sort of laid out this as a methodological problem or a shortcoming of a lot of research, excuse me, in psychology and related disciplines like economics. And then I spent about the next 10 years after that trying to explain where it was that these global psychological differences that we see in the data were coming from. And that's where the book eventually came in.
Mm-hmm. And maybe it would be good up front just to get your definition of the West. What is the West?
Well, I think one of the main things is that people get hung up on the West, and you know they want to start with a predefined definition as the West. Mm-hmm. What we did is we started with the data, and we were seeing these different patterns of psychology across different societies. They include societies that you would typically call the West, but of course that gets fuzzy, and as you travel eastward in Europe, it might be unclear, and the United States and New Zealand aren't clearly in the western part of Eurasia. So it ends up being a kind of cultural definition. But what the book does is it lays out a theory of where these patterns come from. And in the process, you get a sense for why these features of psychology tend to concentrate in Europe. But it also allows you to explain variation across Italy, say, or variation across Europe, or across China, or in different parts of Africa. Yeah. So the theory is generally applicable, and it gets us away from this, kind of very humanities style, let's define our terms before we have a theory approach.
Yeah. So when we hear words like the West, I think what you're basically saying is the stuff that we'll unpack is that we can understand psychology in ways that aren't strictly going to map onto that geography. It's not like all of the Western hemisphere thinks one way and all of the Eastern hemisphere thinks another way. Even within the geographic West, there are people who are more quote unquote Western than others, such as Southern and Northern Italians and so forth.
Right. So it is the case that there are these global patterns of variation, but once you have a proper theory, you can think about much more micro level patterns of variation and why different countries, say, in what we now think of as Western Europe, might vary.
Mm-hmm. And so before we get into the emergence of weird countries, we need to have some notion of, how cultural evolution works and how humans actually became a cultural species. You say at the beginning of the book, one of the three key aspects of human nature that underlie it is that humans are a cultural species. We differ from primates in other ways. What is a cultural species, and what are the psychological traits that humans have that other apes and animals don't that enable us to be such a species?
Yeah, so the key thing that you want to focus on is our cultural capacities. And what we mean by that is our ability to learn from other members of our social group. So humans, much more than we find in other species, including other primates, is that we come into the world ready to acquire ideas, beliefs, values, motivations, strategies, skills from other members of our social group. And the way our sociality and these learning abilities work is that this process gives rise to a rich cumulative cultural evolution. So one generation learns a few tools and technologies, and they pass it on to the next generation who improves them, sharpens them, adds to them. And this goes on for generation after generation. And this seems to have been the main way that humans adapted to the diverse environments that they came to inhabit as they expanded out of Africa. So, there's 40,000 years ago, there's humans living in the high Arctic, and then in the Australian deserts, and then the islands of Melanesia off the coast of New Guinea. And we seem to have adapted to these different environments in very different ways. And the information that allows us to adapt to these environments is an accumulated product of many generations.
Mm-hmm. And do we have a sense, or is there any kind of consensus around which, when and where we became predominantly cultural learners? Is that thought to be at the time we really started exploding and expanding across the globe, or is it a deeper thing than that in evolutionary
Yeah,
terms?
so there's a debate about that. So I wouldn't say there's consensus. I have made the case that the origins of our cultural capacities are pretty old. So
Mm.
think 2 million years ago, the origins of our genus, so the genus Homo, we begin to get big brain primates who engage in long distance running, seem to be using underground tubers, are doing a lot of hunting, making increasingly sophisticated stone tools. And what we know from studies of non-human primates and other animals, small-scale human societies, is that these things look like they were products of cultural evolution. It doesn't mean we were cultural that in the way we are today, but they look like that these animals were relying heavily on bodies of information that they were acquiring from other individuals. So
Mm-hmm.
something like fire, if we were to drop, any group of university students into the forests of Boston, where I am now, they would be hard pressed to be able to start fire and do the kinds of things they needed to do to survive. But yeah, humans were using fire 2 million years ago and increasingly relying on it over that period.
Mm-hmm. So, they may not have been in the same kind of cultures that we have today, or engage in cultural learning to the extent, but this ability was at least well underway quite a while ago.
Right. So we have a long period, and I and others have made the case that what really drove the expansion of our brains was that our brains grew in order to tap into this vast body of knowledge. So once you get that cumulative process I described, you need brains that are capable of acquiring, storing, and organizing this increasing body of non-genetic information.
Mm-hmm.
So our brain expansions may have been to make us better at that process. So it's this gene culture coevolutionary process that may explain our unusually large brains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to dig into this somewhat as we go in, sort of the analogy between the way culture evolves and the way that biology evolves, the coevolution of these things and how they sort of feed back on each other. In terms of what cultural learning is, what it involves, you write in the beginning that cultural learning will tend to dominate our experiences and intuitions in domains that are important, but too costly or impossible to explore through personal experience or trial and error. Think religion and ritual. What does that mean?
Well, things like religion and ritual are make claims about the world that it's pretty hard to confirm just based on your own life experience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in lots of societies, one of the things I point out in the book is that, rituals seem to have this binding psychological effect on people.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're a young learner learning in that world, you're just seeing the adults doing these rituals, and often they'll be doing them to appease a god or to satisfy the ancestors or something like that. But it turns out that the action of doing that ritual actually binds the group together. And so the ritual has a real functional importance. And the thing that it does, nobody really understands in the group. They think they're helping the god. And how are you supposed to know if the gods exist if you're just, a young hunter-gatherer child trying to make your way in the world, right? Everybody else seems to think the god exists, so press on as if it does, right?
Mhm. Yeah, that brings us to the other two key aspects of human nature that you say underline the book. So one, the second of the three is social norms are assembled into institutions by cultural evolution, and the third is that institutions usually remain inscrutable to those operating within them, like fish and water. And so you just mentioned that we have these rituals, we perform these actions in the world that seem to bind the group together and help it cohere, which is going to have adaptive value by keeping the group together and coordinated. But people often don't really understand the actual function these rituals are performing. They don't necessarily have a theory of how the ritual is leading to group cohesion. They have other types of stories which tend to take the form of religious beliefs. Unpack that a little bit more for us.
Yeah, so I mean, a big thing that I work on is the evolution of religion and ritual, and lots of different. So over the course of human history, the gods seem to have increased in size, which means they're gods of larger numbers of people. They have more power to punish. They're concerned about moral things that occur between strangers, and that seems to have expanded over time. So, one idea is that it was competition among societies that drove this. So, you have different societies that are getting different norms and sets of beliefs, say about different kinds of supernatural agents or how to do rituals. But some of those led to success in this intergroup competition. So those tend to spread and other groups copy them. And so they get more widespread. And over time, this ratchets up the size and changes the nature of rituals to bind groups together. Now, the actors within these institutions don't really understand what's going on. They just know that they don't know, they just follow the norms and rituals, and then their society is more successful or less successful, depending on the details. So that's one idea for how religions of rituals have changed over long periods of time. One of the things I look at in the book is the evolution of marriage systems. So, for example, in Canada and the US now, there's a debate about polygyny. Should men and women be allowed to take additional spouses?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've made the case, and I make the case in The Weirdest People in the World, that the evolution of strictly normative monogamous societies actually had societal level benefits, even though in most societies over human history, elite and high status males were able to take additional wives. So, in some sense, curved what otherwise develops naturally. But then this led to societal level benefits. But people engaging in monogamy and avoiding polygyny don't think, well, I need to do this to stop the creation of this unruly pool of unmarried men with no
Right.
chance of mating our marriage market. They just think that this is right and appropriate and this is how God wants it, or this is,
Yeah.
unfair to other people to not do this way or something like that.
Yeah. In some sense, we're seeing things play out today in terms of how people don't actually recognize why certain norms are in place
Right.
and
So
what the
that,
societal
yeah.
level impacts are. So let's just define explicitly for people so they can follow along. What are social norms and institutions, and why is there a tendency to see this coalescence of norms and behaviors into institutions? Does that have something to do with information transmission and evolvability?
Yeah, so in the way I approach all this, we need to explain things that people like sociologists and others take for granted, anthropologists as well. So, social norms are cases where you can learn both the behavior, say a food taboo, don't eat pigs, and a rule for judging others, judging norm violators. So, what do you think about pig eaters? So, if you're a non-pig eater, what do you think about pig eaters? And it becomes a social norm when most people in the group are doing it and they have negative reactions to people doing it a different way. And that'll lock up the group on a social norm. So once you're a sufficiently good cultural learner, these things are just going to pop up because you can learn both the standards for judging others and the behavior. And if you get the right combination of those, you'll get a proliferation of all kinds of different social norms. So that you get just as a product of being sufficiently cultural.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here I just want to call an institution a set of interconnected norms. So one simple example that we know is ancient is marriage systems. People have all kinds of rules about who can marry, when they can marry, and then the rules guiding, the exchange between the families and what are the various roles of the people involved in the marriage and whatnot. So it's an institution because it's a clump of social norms that defined how things operate.
hmm And so if we think about societies today or even other societies in the past, bands of hunter gatherers, if I'm hearing you correctly, so institutions are are these entities where these norms coalesce and they sort of like provide a rule set for how these norms should be followed and how to punish defectors or violators and things like this. Today, like, we often can point to, literally a building and say, that is our CDC building, and that is literally the institution where it's sort of formally housed. But I would imagine that historically the institutions were housed, so to speak, in things like rituals. So if you think of marriage as an institution, you didn't necessarily had to have a marriage building somewhere and someone inside of it, writing down what the marriage rules were, but there was this ritual that everyone participated in on a recurring basis in the culture.
Yeah, so the institution actually exists distributed across the minds of the people in the group.
Yeah.
I mean, there might be, for example, in if you're actually going through the ritual ceremony of marriage, it might be that the men know how to do one part of it and the women know how to do another part of it, and they don't know how to do the men don't know how to do the woman's part. But collectively, we can do this. And then there's a set of standards for where we live after we get married. Do we live with the bride's family or the husband's family? And then what do the kids inherit? Do they inherit stuff from the father's side or the mother's side? So there's all these different rules that anthropologists have documented across societies. Now, if you want to get to the modern world, you have to think about another layer on top of that, which is the formal institution.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point, people got together and said, hey, we have to formalize all this informal stuff we've been doing. So they began writing things down,
Mm-hmm.
and which solidifies it and has interesting effects in addition to the informal institution. But I'm really starting at a point like, forget about writing and all the kind of stuff of the modern world. We got to get there. So this is part of the process of getting there. And then what the kind of things you're thinking of are, okay, now let's write it all down and figure it out. One of the things I think we're learning in the modern world is that you can have all these written laws, but there's all kinds of informal stuff that's not written down
Yeah.
about what people can do and accept it. And then if some entrepreneurial politicians decide they're not going to follow those rules, then the institution can get pretty fragile because it hinges on both the unspoken norms and on the written laws, right?
Yeah, and I would imagine too. Perhaps we'll come to this towards the end when we talk about the present and the future. But even though today we have things like formal institutions and everything's codified into laws, you can literally go read things that are written down. Um, as institutions sort of grow and evolve and eventually start to break down in certain ways, if the formal institution starts to deviate from the actual traditions and rituals that the people that it's meant to govern are practicing, then these things can become misaligned over time.
Yep, you get these mismatches. Yep.
So I want to talk a little bit about religion here and its tie into ritual and social norms and things. You say towards the beginning that we evolved as a species to put faith in the accumulated wisdom of our forebears, and that this faith instinct is at the core of our species' success. My reading of that is that our ability to be cultural learners actually sort of baked in the types of psychological dispositions that naturally then gave rise to religious and supernatural beliefs.
Right. That's exactly right. And when I have another book called The Secret of Our Success, where I lay out these ideas more extensively. And the way I approach that is I show that in many human societies, there are complex procedures. So one I give an example of is throughout the tropics, people rely on eating something called cassava. It's also called manioc. And there are types of manioc which are high in cyanide. So you have to do a complex procedure to get all the cyanide out of it. Now, the individuals who do this haven't done experiments and they don't know which steps are involved or how long you're supposed to wait or how much water you're supposed to put in, but they're applying a formula that guarantees them that they don't have the cyanide in the cassava at the end. So in order for that to evolve as a learner, you have to put faith in what you're learning from the previous generations and just do it the way they do it because that worked and that came down to you through this long cultural evolutionary process. So that's true for lots of tools and whatnot. In an era before science and the FDA and things like that. So that's the origins of this tendency. Some psychologists call it over-imitation, but you're putting faith in the wisdom of ancestors over, your own skepticism, your own experience. Sometimes you might feel like, well, it seems like maybe we should do it this way, but you're just going to follow the procedure because you don't know what those little steps could do. They could be crucial for these more complicated things to work out. And then the next step would be like, okay, what exists in the world? Are there ghosts? Are there gods? Does this ritual really bring me good hunting? I don't know. The ancestors have been doing it. Let's do the ritual and maybe we'll get better hunting out of it. That sort of thing.
Yeah. And that would explain why, there's so many things in different cultures around the world where something is like correct in a sense, like it matches up with the environment. Like, in the example you gave, they are correctly avoiding cyanide poisoning, even though they don't have microscopes and they don't know what cyanide is explicitly. There's any number of things you can think of here, sort of like one would be like the ayahuasca brew. People always like ask, oh, how on earth did people figure out how to do that? And I think you would probably say something like, well, it wasn't like one person figured it out. It probably evolved in a somewhat haphazard way through trial and error over time. And it was passed on because it worked to achieve some outcome. And then people simply just kept doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can show lots of good examples where you'll build up to a recipe for something that works really well, whereas, there's no single individual you can point to who came up with that. I mean, just a simple example from the more modern world, is somewhat more modern, would be the light bulb. So people think Edison invented the light bulb, but in Britain, people think Joseph Swan invented it. Russians have another guy they think invented it. And it was actually, there were already 22 light bulbs patented before Edison showed up on the scene. So he was just tinkering with an existing technology, right?
Yeah.
But so who invented the light bulb? Actually, there's probably hundreds of guys who invented the light bulb, and Edison is just the one that we give the credit for. He also got rich on it, but
Yeah, yeah. That was the one that happened to gain widespread traction because he was tinkering with something that was already there in embryo, at least, or actually in a pretty mature form. The
yeah, I
light
mean, he
bulb.
saw a light bulb on in a Boston shop
Yeah,
as a young
yeah.
man.
Interesting. So, the word meme has itself evolved in kind of funny ways over time. But if we go back to the Richard Dawkins selfish gene definition of meme, a meme is supposed to be the cultural analog of a gene. It's supposed to be sort of a unit of culture that can play into cultural evolution the same way that genes are sort of units of biological selection. Do you think that analogy holds? And if so, if memes are the cultural analog to genes and biology, what are norms and institutions analogous to?
So broadly, there is a sense in which genetic evolution and cultural evolution, they both share the transmission of information. I think where the meme concept went wrong is Dawkins and others later reasoned like, okay, so genes are discrete units that are highly preserved, so they have fecundity and longevity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's two of the key things that genes have. Now, culture can achieve many of those things, even if it doesn't have longevity and fecundity, and it's not a discrete trait. So it's easy to show how if you have a continuous trait, like say how long you make your arrow, that's just going to vary. It's a number of millimeters or something. But if you tend to copy people who are better hunters, the arrow is going to approach the optimal arrow length as long as people are making errors and the arrows are varying somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be able to approach the optimal length, but it's not discrete, right?
Right.
So there's a bunch of stuff that the meme idea imports that you don't really need, but it still has this procession of the flow of information through time and a filtering process. Um, Now, the other things like norms, a norm is actually a group level property
Mm-hmm.
because we have to have a sufficient frequency of people doing the behavior and a sufficient frequency of people who will judge those who don't do the behavior negatively, and that causes it to lock up. So it's a property, and it's kind of discrete in the sense that there is a point, at which these things lock up, but it's a group level property.
Mm-hmm. So, we can mostly take for granted in this discussion that humans obviously became different from other species and other apes at some point. We became these cultural learners, and culture started to really take over, and you get this sort of very interesting culture biology coevolution. But after we'd already become cultural learners, there are various points in history where major shifts happened that um, caused a lot of psychological change and gave a lot of sort of cultural feedback that then helped direct biological evolution. One of those areas, times in history that I want to talk about is the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to farming and sedentary societies. at a high level, sort of when and where did that start to happen, and what were sort of the major effects of that transition on the psychological traits that started to get selected for and against?
So that's a origins of food production is probably 10 to 12,000 years ago. You get the domestication of plants and animals. The earliest sites we have are in the Middle East, but then relatively soon after that, you also get some in China. And so this is going to put pressure on institutions because now you have a way of producing a lot of calories and potentially supporting larger populations. But in order to do that, you need institutions, you need to be able to defend territory. And so there's a bunch of downstream effects of this. And so there's this period of cultural evolution where agriculture is getting institutions that better fit it, that fit the local ecology. Groups are shifting their kinship system so as to defend territory. And when you grow up in a world with these different kinds of kinship systems, say based on clans instead of this sort of networky stuff that hunter-gatherers have, then you get a more of a parochial, in-group oriented kind of psychology. Now, this is not, there's no reason to think that is a genetic evolutionary process at this point. We know from contemporary data that this is shaping people's cultural psychology. You're growing up in a world with norms which are increasingly calling on you to put your clan first. Your welfare and your people taking care of you in your old age. It depends on this clan network that has emerged through this set of norms.
Mm-hmm. And at a high level, I would imagine just when you transition from a hunter-gatherer social structure to a farming structure, you have to plan around seasons. You've now got these food surpluses that you have to defend and store. So naturally, the group is going to have to be organized in a different way to handle how you're dealing with your food and defending it and things like this. And as you said, this can be an entirely cultural process. But I imagine too, when these sort of societies started to coalesce and stabilize, you're now in a different cultural environment, which is going to create different kinds of selection pressures that can feed back on what is or is not biologically advantageous. Can you talk about that a little bit? And I mean, off the top of my head, I know that David Reich and others have shown recently, and many others have over the years to different extents, that in fact the origins of agriculture are tied to a lot of really clear biological evolution and directional selection in humans.
Yeah, I mean, so in The Secret of Our Success, I talk about that quite a bit. I mean, the best documented cases are these shifts in like starch processing genes because you're relying a lot more on starch. That's something that still varies around the world today. Lactose processing. So if you get the evolution of cows, for example, or camels, and dairying practices, then normally humans they lose their ability to produce milk, sometime after weaning, so in early childhood. But some populations, because of the presence of cows and milk, began to be able to process milk into adulthood. So this kind of throws a monkey wrench in the normal shutdown system for the production of the lactase enzyme, which breaks down the milk sugars. And whether a population has these seems to depend on it inventing or adopting dairying practices relatively early, but then not inventing cheese and yogurt processing, which is a sort of cultural evolutionary way to get to the same end.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's
either
just an example. What's that?
Biology and culture can allow you to extract calories from that type of food source.
That's right. So there's a couple different solutions. One's genetic, and so the genetic one happened in some populations because of the details of how cultural evolution unfolded. And Reich's new paper with Ali Akbar shows, using polygenic scores from the modern world, that it looks like there's been genetic selection on lots of different stuff among European populations in the last.
Yeah, and not just metabolism, but things like cognition, behavior, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I love that paper, but there's a lot of water yet to go under the bridge on that one because, I mean, it's tricky because you're using modern polygenic scores based on things like the UK Biobank, and you're spotting alleles that predict educational attainment, for example. And then you're saying, what was going on with these alleles 10,000 years ago? Well, we know they weren't predicting educational attainment 10,000 years ago because there was no education to predict. So we got to figure out what they were doing and what was
Yeah.
favoring.
So we're making a presumption that because they make that prediction in today's world, they were somehow linked to what we might call cognition or intelligence or whatever back then. But it's really blurry exactly how you connect those dots, I would imagine.
Right. So there's lots more work to be done.
And another aspect of the transition into sedentary agricultural societies that I think is important and interesting is how this affected people's religious beliefs, the types of gods and the properties their gods had that they believed in. Can you give us a sense for what that transition was like, how religion itself and the types of deities and beliefs people have changed as they became sedentary farmers?
Right. So, I mean, the gods of many hunter-gatherer societies are often weak and whimsical, and they're moral in the same way people are moral, right? So they're morally flawed, they make mistakes, they get drunk, they give away secrets they shouldn't give away.
Hmm.
But over time, in order to bind these groups together, we've argued that I mean, the evidence is the gods got bigger and more powerful, better able to punish, the god of larger numbers of groups. So many gods in the past have been just tribal gods,
Mhm.
right? But then eventually we got gods of everybody. Of the whole world rather than just certain regions. And many people accepted that the Israelites have their God and the Canaanites have their God, and there's
Yeah.
all these different gods, and it's everybody believes all the gods exist. It's just that we have our guy. But gradually that changes over time. And one of our arguments is that particular supernatural beliefs and particular rituals that go along with those allowed people to cooperate in larger groups, engage in economic relationships, keep the group together, things like that.
Hmm. And I would imagine a lot of this just has to do with the fact of how societies just scale up in terms of population size. If you're able to farm and build up food surpluses, that gives you the potential to support larger populations. But if you're going to do that, that's eventually going to necessitate people from different kinship groups coming together. And at that point, you need something to keep them together. And it can't be you have your God, I have my God, because that's what binds your individual kinship groups together. You need something like a universal, all seeing God that all of them sort of recognize as the essence of the culture at writ large.
Yeah. And in the book, I actually discuss one interesting case we have from New Guinea, where in New Guinea, like lots of places, clans have their own clan god. It's seen as like an ancestor that gave rise to the rest of the clan. People do rites and rituals and stuff to appease or to satiate the clan god. But then it's this case where they adopted this cult from this other group that was expanding, and that god was actually a clan god, but that when they adopted it, they didn't know that, and they
Mm.
saw it as a god over the other gods. So they created a super
Mm-hmm.
god.
So there's like
And
a
then
mutation in
he
the
was the god of
cultural.
all, it
Yeah.
was a mutation. It
Yeah.
was a god of all these clans. And then that seemed to, that along with some ritual stuff allowed the group to cooperate more. So it's an actual case where you can see the god expand and
Yeah.
then make the group stronger.
Yeah. And tying that back to what we were talking about earlier about how cultural evolution actually proceeds, no one engineered that change. It was just sort of a mistake that popped up and it happened to work for that group, which enabled them to survive at the expense of other groups, I would imagine.
Right, right. And lots of cases in history of groups saying, those guys are so successful, they must have powerful gods. We should learn more about their god and,
Mm-hmm.
trying to take
Yeah.
them on.
So in some sense, the gods are sort of a way people talk about the actual cultural evolutionary dynamics governing their groups that they don't actually have an explicit sort of theory and understanding of. But nonetheless, people come up with religious beliefs and language systems so that those are sort of pointing to the same thing. When people talk about their gods, in some sense, I think they're actually talking about the cultural evolutionary process itself.
Right, someone in the background, right?
And so, eventually we get so religion changes, you start having these universal gods. This is changing and it's bound up with how people relate to each other, both their kin, people closely genetically related to them, people more distantly genetically related to them, and then even eventually people who are even more distantly related. How did from the dawn of agriculture to sort of the start and the progression of Western sort of Christian cultures in Europe, how did people's relationship with kin and with strangers start to change?
Well, Broadly, the overall process is that there's a bunch of different sort of social technologies that are evolving and spreading around that are allowing people to engage with strangers. So, for example, in the Mediterranean world, one of the ways in which gods would help this process is a little bit sort of, it's not a very Christian approach, but we would go to a god, and that there would be a big trading market, and then nearby there would be altars and stuff you could go to. So you'd go with a guy who you want to trade oil for olives. Well, I guess that wouldn't make sense. Oil for olives for steel.
Hmm.
And, you're from different parts and you got to make this deal and you could both profit from it if you can do it, but you got to trust the guy. So you would both swear on a god that you shared in common. And you
Mm.
swear an oath to the god, that's a big deal because people took oaths and honor very seriously. So if you were to break that oath, there's a chance the god's going to zap you. So it was a way of using this honor psychology to allow long distance trade to occur.
Hmm. And it's not like there's a date and a city we can point to here, but at some point after sedentary agriculture starts, you eventually get what you call weird cultures or weird societies, what some people call Western culture. Roughly, when and where did this start to happen? It's, at some point, we talk about European history, and if you go back far enough, you get the origins of agriculture. Somewhere in between, these sort of weird societies must have emerged. Is there an approximate sort of first weird culture that you can point to?
Well, so I have an origin story, which is that the main thing that would have driven parts of Europe to be increasingly weird is the spread of a set of beliefs about the family and marriage systems that begins in late antiquity with the diffusion of Christianity. So the Western Church, which eventually evolves into what we think of as the Roman Catholic Church,
Mhm.
adopts in 300, 400, 500, that time period, a set of policies about marriage that prevents people from marrying their cousins, for example, and begins to change the inheritance system so that individuals can pass on to their kids without all of their kinfolk jumping in on it. Um, Neolocal residence, which means the husband and wife live separately from the family, which weakens kin connections. A bunch of things that weaken kin connections, and eventually, over 500 years or so, break many of the populations in many parts of Europe down into monogamous nuclear families. And these are quite different kinship structures than we find throughout Europe and that anthropologists have documented around the world. And then in the ashes of the destruction of all these different kin groups, you begin to see the rise of impersonal institutions, where groups of strangers get together. And so by 1000 CE, you have the rise of monasteries that aren't based on lineages. So there are monasteries before that, but they're family based and
Mhm.
lineage based. Things like groups like the Cistercians. And you get the beginning of universities, which are either kind of unions of students or unions of professors. Eventually, those meet up. And you also get self-help groups where people will join because you don't have family to support you. So if you get injured, there's nobody to take care of you in old age. Or, I mean, there's nobody to take care of you in old age or if you get injured. And eventually you get charter towns. And so these are towns that are sort of voluntary organizations that you can join and you become a citizen, you get certain rights and privileges, but you also have obligations. And this ends up serving some of the functions that the territorial localized clan, for example, would have taken in a former time.
Mhm. So many of us take this for granted as weird people, like myself, right? We're in one of these societies, these weird cultures. So my whole life, it's just been, a cultural fact of my existence that, well, yeah, you don't marry or think romantically about your cousins or near relatives. And we have sort of like these norms and institutions around marriage and who is an acceptable partner and things like that. What your book really pointed out was not only is that weird historically, but that's still fairly weird on a global scale today. It's for most of human history, most cultures would have considered it perfectly normal and okay to marry a cousin, for example.
Yeah, that's right. And so lots of anthropologists have documented cross cousin marriage is very popular. So it's interesting because there's cross and parallel cousins. And cross cousins are your father's sister's children and your mother's brother's children. And
Mm.
those are marriage partners, right? But your father's brother's children and your mother's sister's children are considered siblings. So it gives you both an expanded sibling circle and particular marriage partners. You can do the same thing out with second cousins and third cousins and whatnot.
Mhm.
So
And so these changing norms around marriage, around mating, what did that have? What were the features of Christianity that led to that? Why did these sorts of changes happen in the Christian world, but didn't happen as much in other cultures?
yeah, and there's actually, you got to think of it in a few layers.
Hmm.
One is it's really Latin Christendom that adopts these. So the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, has some of them, but they tend to be implemented later and not with as much enthusiasm as the Western Church gets into it. So that's a difference. And then other kinds of Christianity. So some of the oldest brands of Christianity, Syriac Christianity, Coptic Christianity, they kept marrying their cousins for another millennium.
Hmm.
So it's not really a Christian thing. It's sort of part of
I see.
Christian.
It's a subset of the Christians. One subset of the Christians did that, and they're still with us today. Another subset did it more weakly, and we call that, I guess, the Eastern Orthodox
Yeah,
branch. And then other subsets didn't do that, but they died out, and we don't really even talk about
yeah,
them.
or they're small. I
Or
mean,
they're small.
they mostly persist in small groups, at least compared to Latin Christianity.
Hmm.
So, and the bigger picture though is if you kind of zoom out from Christianity, there's all these different religions in the
Hmm.
sort of larger Mediterranean, Middle Eastern world, and they're doing different things with the family. So if you look at Islam, which comes along a bit later, but it curbs polygyny, which Christianity curbs polygyny massively down to just one spouse. Uh, Islam curbs it down to just four, but you have to treat them equally. Parallel cousin marriage pops up, so many Muslims marry their father's brother's kid, and so they're playing around with marriage in the family. Over in Zoroastrianism in Persia, actually cousin marriage is preferred.
Hmm.
There, it's a religiously good thing to marry a close cousin, and even at the level of the royalty, sometimes they would have brother-sister marriage because that was seen as a good thing.
Hmm.
So just the important point is lots of variation. People don't really, there's no way to reason through these things and figure it out ahead of time.
Yeah.
But it so happens one group got a combination that led to this change in social structure and is part of the story of the rise of the West.
Hmm. But this also the way that this cultural process happens gives rise to diversities across groups in terms of their norms around marriage and things like that. But that makes it, that diversity makes it very clear that there's then going to be clear feedback on the biology side of this, because I would imagine that your taboos that you have or don't have around cousin marriages will have ramifications for, say, genetic diversity or inbreeding issues moving forward.
Yeah. Cousin marriage, as long as it's not too common, you can detect the effects on the sort of negative inbreeding effects, but you need pretty large populations and pretty large sample sizes. And there is a countervailing factor that people often forget, which is that it actually increases your genetic relatedness in a network. So, for example, if you look at Iceland and you just look at fitness, right? You just count babies, right? Count descendants. It turns out the optimal marriage was second cousins
Hmm.
because you're not very related, so you're not going to get very much inbreeding depression, but you still are creating a large network of relatives for support, social aid, and all the kind of social side of things. Um,
Mhm.
so
So
people often think that part of this story is an inbreeding story. I think the inbreeding story is a weaker end of what's going on.
I see. So there's probably, strictly speaking, from a strict sort of Darwinian reproductive success standpoint, there's probably some intermediate level that's most beneficial in terms of how closely or distantly
Yeah,
related you are to whoever you mate with.
right.
Interesting. How so what were some of the key changes here that we're talking about or that we haven't talked about yet, that I think a lot of what we're talking about, what you point to in the book, is you have these cultural changes that happen in terms of how people think about family structure, how people think about family planning, how they relate to those in their society, that enable society to really scale up in certain ways. How do we tie some of those dots together? So one thing you could mention here, I think, is probably like the monogamy polygyny thing. Why isn't it that more polygynous societies, why can't they scale up to the extent or in the ways that, say, more monogamous societies can?
Right. So the polygyny is a specific, so there's the sort of general kinship story, and I spend extra time on the monogamy polygyny thing because something unique is happening there. That's not just about the tightness of family bonds and the openness to strangers and the willingness to engage in institutions that involve impersonal interactions, but that if you have polygynous marriage and if you have any degree of wealth in the society, your elite and high status males are going to accumulate a lot of wives, and we see this, around the world across continents when you look back into history. And so that's going to always create a large pool of low status unmarried men who are going to have to take great risks in order to get a chance to get into the marriage and mating market. And this leads to raiding, violence in the modern world, leads to substance abuse. So it's just harder to run a society. And you should also think about as enlisting fewer men in the father role.
Mm.
So there's just, you're going to have men that have a lot of children. It's hard to do very much parenting there. And then guys who have no children at the other end, and they're sort of never going to become fathers because they're going to be evolutionary zeros.
Mhm. So it sounds like, that's almost the default state of humans, and it requires some innovations around social norms and institutions to constrain that tendency in ways that enable larger scale societies to build up, where you don't just have this large pool of disaffected
That's
people.
right. So 85% of societies in the anthropological record allowed high status men to take additional wives. In contrast, very few societies have women taking multiple husbands. It's, point 0.1% or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And how do the origins of the concept of so there's this there's both the concept of individualism and universalism. So at some point, people start to think in more individualistic terms. They identify as, I'm Joe, I'm a blacksmith, I do this, I have these attributes. Whereas in a lot of non-weird cultures, that's not really the case. Like obviously there are individual people that exist, but you're sort of, I'm Joe, the son of Jeff. It's all about your clan and your lineage. When did this sort of more individualistic mindset come into the picture, and what was prompting that?
Yeah, so I make the case in the book that the beginning of this process is this breakdown of the family, because
Mm.
as the societies, the sort of underlying family structure is being broken down into monogamous nuclear families, people have got to build new kinds of institutions because in a singular nuclear family, there's not enough support to, deal with income shocks and to deal with the elderly and take care of babies and stuff like that because people are used to sort of spreading this out over a large kin group. So they begin to build these other kinds of institutions, some of which I mentioned, the charter towns, the self-help groups, there's the monasteries, the universities, and there's a bunch of other kind of variants on this. So they're building new kinds of institutions. And that's one of the things that's opening the door. But you're going to these institutions as individuals, and you're trying to build relationships with new friends and partners and stuff. And there's more pressure on you to put forth what you have to offer. So this leads to this emphasis on ourselves and our own qualities, dispositional qualities that are across contexts. Whereas before, the biggest thing you had to offer was the kinship connection to a powerful clan.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the main thing about you, is that you're connected to the so-and-so. So anyway, that's the key shift that occurs. Now you don't have much behind you. It's just your nuclear family. So it's very much about your traits as an individual.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's I mean, it's easy to sort of connect that to the monogamy versus polygyny thing, because if you don't build norms and institutions that instill like if you don't build monogamous norms in your culture, you're not going to be able to build up the pool of nuclear families that then give you this more individual mindset across the full population.
Right. And if you're an elite polygynous male, it means you have lots of children.
Mm-hmm.
And you're marrying the daughters off to other families to strengthen your networks there. And your sons are like this little army you got, right? So
Interesting. Um, and when we talk about institutions, I want to talk a little bit more about what institutions are and how they work. So, I don't know if we want to use, marriage as an example, or monogamy as an example, or whatever, but how do these institutions work, and how do we start to think about what a functional versus dysfunctional institution is? Because, when I read your book, I was reading about sort of this grand view of history and how all these different institutions sprouted up. And obviously they were functional for a long time in some sense, in that they were allowing new social structures to evolve. They were facilitating the scaling up of society, new types of efficiencies to come in with respect to commerce and other things. but also, top of mind for a lot of people today is clearly institutions can break down over time. And so, what are sort of the dynamics governing whether institutions are healthy versus unhealthy, functional versus non-functional, and how do we sort of think about that and measure that in terms of human, the individual well-being of the people that these institutions are meant to sort of govern?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that helps that how we think about institutions is to go back to some of our earlier discussions where we were talking about features of human nature. So part of our primate instincts is these closeness to kin, willingness to help close kin. We're also good at building long, enduring relationships. Now, in modern institutions, the impersonal institutions of the modern world, that's nepotism and cronyism,
Mm-hmm.
right? So those are two things that corrode well-functioning impersonal institutions because people begin to make backroom deals. There's bribery. You take care of your cousin. So and so's got a friend. Let's hire him. That sort of thing. So those things are always in tension, and that sort of old primate ways of thinking, the tribalism, biases towards members of your own ethnic group, are always in tension with these impersonal institutions where, we want to hire the best person. We want to use a merit-based system. We're just going to take applications from the world and, not hire someone we know, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is
And
that what you had in mind? I don't know if that addresses the question.
yeah, I think to some extent, we'll probably get into this more later as well when we start, talking about, what happens when you start intermixing people under the umbrella of a given set of institutions that were actually sort of brought up under a different set of institutions, especially, once transportation became more readily available to people. But, just like when we think of, when we think of what allows a society to scale up or prosper, is a healthy institution essentially if we kind of put a functional definition on this, is it just one that enables the greatest number of people to say have a family, or how do we think about like metrics by which we would gauge this type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine normative metrics. One of the main things in the book, though, I focus on is that really these institutions are, groups adopt institutions and then the groups compete. So, for example, the charter towns in Europe, one of the reasons we get representative political bodies is
Mm-hmm.
that there were all these charter towns in Europe and they were offering citizens uh, benefits essentially. Their sets of right packages that they would join the charter town, and the best blacksmith could move around and they could go to other charter towns, which gave them a better deal. And one of the things that people wanted was some say in the government. So then people began, forming representative bodies, and then sometimes there was voting and those kinds of things. So you get this gradual assembly of stuff because it allowed groups of mostly strangers to be able to make decisions and interact. So you get this evolution through intergroup competition, but it was basically how prosperous town life is. We don't have any good data on happiness back then, but those things don't always go together. One of the things I point out to people is that, happiness goes up as countries get wealthier, but within those countries, the people with the biggest kin networks are often the happiest. So having strong family ties is associated with happiness.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose, sort of this kinship clan mindset is, it's really baked in and it's still there, and so you need something to actively promote a different type of structure. Otherwise, I would imagine that, even weird people in some ways sort of default back to kin preferences, in-group
Oh yeah,
preferences.
yeah, yeah. Kin, and also people who have a relationship with. So you can think of them as kin and friends. Um, People you have long-term partnerships are also part of the story here. So I think that basically that, a lot of impersonal institutions are constantly fighting against that to varying degrees.
Mhm. And what are some of the other major institutions you might point to that characterize weird cultures?
Well, a big one that emerges in the High Middle Ages is individualist-based law. So
Mhm.
the idea that the center of law is about rights bestowed on the individual. Actually, most individuals weren't even legal entities in the Roman Empire.
Hmm.
It was the living head of a family that was the legal entity, and he was responsible for everybody in his household, in his lineage. And so, if you committed a crime, you didn't go to court; he went to court, and he had to adjudicate and make peace with the other families and stuff. And this was common in lots of societies. So the idea that it was the rights of the individual that matter and that's what shaped laws and whatnot is an important part of it. During this process, the idea that mental states play a big role
Hmm.
became increasingly important.
Like
You
intention,
know,
say? in the legal
the
context.
centrality of it are intentions. And just, you know, so if someone gets killed by another person, we spend all this time sorting out whether they meant to do it, did they premeditate it. There's a
Mhm.
lot of mental state attribution, and the penalties vary dramatically depending on
Right.
what the determinations are on their mental states. In lots of places, you know, did he kill him or didn't he kill him? And if the arrow flew out of his bow,
That's it.
then he's the murderer, and you know, because the outcome's the same, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So outcome based versus sort of intention
Yeah.
based. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And I mean, that's like, as you just mentioned, that's bound up with the sort of mentalizing ability, the ability to imagine and project mental states onto someone and take that into account in terms of how how their mental states relate to their actions.
Yeah, so we did this battery of experiments with really striking results that, you know, the Western populations were seemed obsessed with mental states, you know, for all kinds, but you know, the beliefs of the actor, the intentions of the actor, and then there were societies, you know, full range, all the way down to the other end where mental states seemed to play no role.
Mhm. And you mentioned at the beginning that, you know, if we sort of dichotomize the world into more weird cultures and non-weird cultures, Western educated, industrial, democratic, what's the one I'm missing?
Western educated industrials, rich.
Rich and democratic. So you got weird cultures, you've got non-weird cultures. There's a spectrum here. The psychological attributes these people tend to have, and therefore their behaviors differs. But also, you know, within a weird geography. You know, you mentioned Italy earlier. There's variation along the spectrum. What are some examples of that you might point to from history where, you know, even within, say, a part of Europe, you had very different cultures emerge in two different sub areas of that region?
Yeah, I mean the two obvious places to look, well, I mean, I guess they're actually part of the same one, which is that the Carolingian Empire appears about 800.
What is
And
that?
you know, this is Pepin the Short and Charlemagne.
Mm,
They start teaming up with the Pope, and they're creating what became the parish system of the Catholic Church. And part of that, they're really imposing all of these taboos about marriage and lineage and inheritance and that sort of thing. And so if you go to Italy, you might think, well, Italy is home of the Catholic Church. It was all sort of equally exposed. But it turns out northern Italy got a big dose of this because they were in the Carolingian Empire. And southern Italy was controlled by what becomes the Orthodox Church. Places like Sicily and Sardinia were under Muslim rule for a long time. So they get a much weaker dose of this marriage and family program. And what we're able to do is explain the variation in the sort of trust in strangers, pro-sociality, willing to give blood to strangers across Italian provinces by knowing the history of Italy and the adoption of these cousin marriage practices. So if you do something simple like take rates of cousin marriage in the 93 Italian provinces and use it to predict anonymous blood donations, you find that the places with the lowest rates of cousin marriage they have the most anonymous blood donation,
hmm,
which is a good measure of helping a stranger, right? It's kind of a
right.
pain thing. You got to go there, but it really helps someone who you don't know and will never see again, right? Or will never see at all.
Hmm.
Um,
So
so
in other words, what you're saying is historically, if you look across Europe or across anywhere, I guess, but across Europe, you can find that there's variation in how long people were exposed to institutions of the church that were pushing things like monogamous pair bonding and so forth. And when you look at how much people in a given region were exposed to those religious institutions, you know, hundreds of years ago, that actually predicts the psychology of people that you can see even to this day.
today, yeah. And so when we build this data set, what we did is we got the diffusion of Latin bishoprics across Europe, and we get a GPS location and a date. And then, so that means for each, you know, with 1.5 by 1.5 degree section of Europe, so a small section of Europe, we get how much, what the dosage is, how long they spent under the Catholic Church. And then we use that to predict things like trust, individualism, fairness towards strangers in the modern world. And we find that places that had a longer exposure to the church, which varied from almost 0 to 1,000 years, you know, that explains a lot of the variation in
Mhm.
these psychological traits.
Yeah, and so one of the attributes in these weird sort of Christian influenced societies was this concept of helping total strangers. I wonder, so as time goes on, obviously technology develops, and who could be a stranger you run into changes in the sense that, you know, if we go back to the Middle Ages, you run into people you don't know, but they're going to be local people. You're not going to get someone from around the globe who's from a completely different culture showing up. And so when you trust a stranger, you're still trusting someone who's probably within the same overall weird culture. How does that tendency itself perhaps start to break down in future contexts like today, where now, all the people you might run into as strangers, they're not all part of or weren't brought up in the same type of weird culture, which has this mindset of not being sort of more nepotistic and kinship based. And now you start intermixing people from all those different cultures together. Does that tendency itself, which sort of helped some of these weird societies scale up and survive back then, maybe have a less adaptive role to play today?
Well, it certainly means that it helps you explain some patterns in the world. For example, there's studies in economics that look at where the CEOs of different companies come from,
Mm-hmm.
and when they come from a less trusting place, which is going to be affected by your history of church exposure and lots of other factors. They give less freedom to their engineers to engage in innovation, and so those companies are less innovative.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because you can study the same company as they change CEOs to get the causality.
Interesting. So, like the level of innovation within a single company can vary according to essentially the culture the CEO was brought up in.
Right. And if they come from a trusting place, then they give more freedom to their creative employees, and then that results in more patents in this case.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, on the topic of religion broadly speaking, you say that some religions offer this sort of key trifecta of things for people. One, interdependent networks that provide mutual aid. Two, shared commitments to sacred norms. And three, rituals and supernatural beliefs that help manage existential anxiety and uncertainty. When you look at the landscape of religions today, what religions today would you say have sort of the features or the cultural phenotypes we might say that are most conducive to spread? Do you think some of them are more likely to see success in terms of spread in the future than others?
Yeah, I mean, there's huge amount of variation. Uh, I mean, in Latin America, these evangelical religions coming out of the southern part of the United States have been super successful and are replacing Catholicism in a lot of places. So those ones seem to really have legs. And they're ones where there was a huge number of different evangelical sects, and they've all been competing. But then as they spread out to the world, certain ones like the Assemblies of God and stuff have been particularly successful in the South Pacific or in Latin America, places like that.
Mm-hmm. And when you think about the history of the West to the present, I wonder what sort of your thoughts are on the evolutionary relationship between different forms of Christianity. So, if I try and think of Christian denominations the way I would think about like a phylogenetic tree of species, if I was an evolutionary biologist, obviously you've got the Catholic Orthodox split, and then eventually you get Protestantism budding off from Catholicism, and then you get say Puritanism and things like this that then go and seed the U.S. So there's sort of this branching structure, and I'm not an expert on this stuff, but you can also sort of see that some of them are more weird than others, according to your definition in the book. So, Protestants are, born from the printing press and this idea of an individual interfacing with God and reading. And so Catholics, even though they're still quote unquote weird, that's a bit more of a hierarchical, like kinship style of organization. Are these different Christian lineages related at all? Do you think of them in that way? And are there potentially even relationships between modern day, what we nominally secular movements, like political movements, and Christian denominations?
Well, so certainly to the first part of the question is that in the book, I make the case that Protestantism is kind of born of this process. So as certain parts of Europe are becoming more individualistic,
Mm-hmm.
people are actually preferring uh, they don't know it at the time, but they're preferring more Protestant views of Christianity. And the single biggest way to think about this is Protestants come up with this idea that every individual should read the Bible for themselves
Mm-hmm.
and has the right to, have an opinion. And this is really a strange notion for most of religions, at least in agricultural societies. The idea that every guy on the street can read the sacred text for themselves and then come to their own view is a very strange idea, but it's very much an individual view where everybody can
Mm-hmm.
have a look at the text and then we can, have a debate about it or have a discussion about it. And then you get the proliferation of new religions and each one with a different theology. And it does lead to sort of more emphasis, occupations in Protestantism, at least some sects, become a calling, right? You're doing your job as a blacksmith because, God wants you to do that job and you work extra hard. And there's lots of good evidence, I think, now for the idea that Protestantism leads people to spend longer hours at work, essentially.
Mhm.
There's some interesting experiments in Germany.
Mhm. Are we seeing echoes today of that that sort of that strongly expressed individualism in terms of, say, patterns of psychological distress? So I imagine, if you take everything to an extreme and everyone's fully atomized as individuals, and, you're not just not in a sort of kinship mindset and living with your clan, but I physically moved hundreds of miles away from my next of kin, and so I'm truly atomized, even more than people would have been in the early days of Protestantism. Does this tie into this extreme level of atomization and individualism? This tie into things like psychological distress
Yeah.
and the means by which people deal with it?
I mean, I think there's a straight line that runs from the individualism in Protestant to, patterns in the modern world where a high proportion of individuals actually live alone.
Mm.
Just the percentage of people who live alone. Protestantism went along with an increase in suicidality, so that this greater individualism, loneliness, solitariness. There even the breaking down of community organizations, like the kind of bowling alone side of things, just looks like a more and more individualism. Even basically the nuclear family is breaking apart.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so in weird countries or weird societies, right, you have this notion of individualism. At the same time, there's this other notion that I think some people just call it universalism. So we're all individuals, but at the same time, sort of the same law should apply equally to everyone. The God is sort of all seeing, all knowing. Everyone has the same God and so forth. How do those two things sort of coexist and dance together? The notion of an individual and individualism, and these universalist beliefs that tend to characterize, different versions of Christianity.
Yeah. So they go together very much in the sense that the individualism side of things says that you should see each other person not as a member of an ethnic group or as a member of a kin group or anything like that. You don't see them as a member of a certain family, but you see them as an individual with their own properties and dispositions and attributes and whatnot, and you should treat them as such. And then the individualism is just saying, look, there's sort of a basic level of treatment that you should give everybody. You should be fair, you should be honest, all those kinds of things that we think of as moral.
Mm-hmm.
And it applies to everyone, and you give it to each individual. You don't give it to some groups, but not others, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And if a lot of these Christian inspired institutions help establish the cultural environment in which universalism could thrive, does the disintegration or the change of these institutions and how they're operating pose a problem for some of these belief systems moving forward?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, and I'm not sure about the answer to that one because many things about Christianity have infused themselves into the culture in a way that you can strip off the religious stuff and it still seems to hold, or at least hold
Yeah.
in the short term. So a simple example would be the notion of human rights. So that's like kind of right out of Christianity, right? Once you're an individualistic, rights sort of make an intuitive sense and you can adopt a kind of moral universalism. So most people think of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights not as a Christian document, but as a good piece of philosophy or something like that. But it's just because it makes good sense to a weird mind.
Yeah, so there's a bit of an irony there. I think we often don't think of that as a Christian document. In a sense, it's not literally, but that type of universalist thinking is basically a direct descendant of at least certain
Right.
sects of
It's a
Christianity.
descendant of a Christian
We
world.
just don't remember that.
Right.
Right. Interesting. When we think about weird cultures and how they're changing, and especially today with the modern world, right? Like we have planes, trains, and automobiles. We can move around. People often do. These are tied to hot button issues of today. But what starts to happen? So you scale up a society, but everyone in that society is got a pretty similar culture. So if you're talking about, say, a weird society, a Western European society, most of the people that were in that society as it was coming up through the Middle Ages into the present would have been Christian in some form or another, and they would have been, similar along these different dimensions of culture. But now, people can move to different countries, they can move to completely different cultures and embed themselves in a society in which the people around them were growing up and enculturated with a completely different culture. So what starts to happen if you start taking, say, people from non-weird countries and putting them in weird countries, or vice versa? Can those things sort of play nice together in a melting pot sense, or is that going to have a destabilizing effect in general?
Well, I mean, certainly it all depends on the size of the inflow. So if you're thinking about something like immigration,
Mm-hmm.
uh, immigrants can come in and they're going to have to deal with how to integrate with the majority culture. The majority culture is going to be might get some interesting ideas, novel foods, new technologies, and things like that. So it's super good for innovation. And the thing about cultural evolution as opposed to genetic evolution is the children of those immigrants will be culturally very similar to the larger society. They'll speak English fluently. They'll speaking or whatever the language is. They'll speak that like the locals, not like their parents. They'll be like the locals in many ways. Although you can still pick up an echo in second generation immigrants of where mom and dad came from, but it peters out pretty quickly over a couple generations. So.
Mm-hmm. Sort of
So it all
given,
depends on the size of the inflow. If you turn up the migration enough, you're going to have a big mess. Um, but it's super good for innovation. So if you're just thinking about a pure economic point of view, there's an optimal inflow which won't disturb the
yeah,
they're well-functioning institutions. They might not be, but
yeah,
let's say they're well-functioning. It won't disturb that, but it'll provide an injection of new ideas that'll really fuel innovation.
yeah. I guess the idea there would be, obviously, you don't want a monoculture. It's pretty intuitive to most people why monocultures are often, I mean, they're monocultures. Everyone would be thinking the same way. If you start bringing in some people from other cultures, that's going to naturally lead to innovation because you're getting cross fertilization of ideas. New things are coming in. You're just going to have more novelty. But obviously, you can't crank that up too high because then everything just becomes generally destable. So there is some sort of optimal balance there of intermixing different cultures.
Right. Right. And a lot depends on too the age. So younger immigrants acculturate better and more quickly. And yeah, so
Mm-hmm. So one thing I want to ask you about the modern world, and for now, we'll just talk about the U.S. or Western Europe broadly speaking. But we've had various technological innovations that have ramifications for some of the things that you've talked about with me here and that are in your book that were very important for enabling our society to scale up to what it is. So when we think about something like norms around monogamy and marriage, those have started to change radically, even just in my lifetime, in the last couple of decades. Marriage rates are much lower than they used to be. Divorce rates are higher. The proliferation of things like the internet and social media and dating apps in particular has really just changed the mating market. So given the history of weird countries, how they scaled up, and how that was enabled by norms around, say mating, where do you sort of see things going in our culture from here forward? Is there a destabilizing effect that we really have to deal with when it comes to some of these technological innovations that we have now?
yeah, I mean, I got interested in this question several years ago when a graduate student, a postdoc, actually was talking to me about the incels. So these groups of men who are involuntarily celibate. And so that got us digging into the literature on this. And it does look like the dating apps and the sort of new ways that people are mating are creating a problem because so beginning in the 1970s, at least this starts in the US, women begin entering the labor market in substantial numbers. And you can be well, so this then creates a problem in the mating market because generally females are hypergamous across human societies. They prefer to find long-term mates who are equal or higher status. And that means if they're already so far high up in the status hierarchy, they're only going to prefer the men that are above them, basically, and the same. All the guys that are below them, they're not going to be interested in. And
Mm-hmm.
this creates something similar to polygamy. So you have a growing number of women who are preferring the high status men, and then a bunch of the low status men are getting essentially have no opportunity because they're lower than the places that most women in the mating market are. So this you can see this right in the data from the dating apps. So 50% of all men on dating apps get no likes at all.
50?
And then 50%, right? So
Wow.
this is data you can look at OkCupid or Tinder or whatnot.
Yeah.
And then there's a small percentage of men, the top 5%, top 1%, that get, a huge percentage of all the total likes. So basically all the women pick the same small number of guys.
Hmm.
It's kind of like bonobos. And so anyway, despite having all this female choice in the mating market, you still end up with this big inequity. And this is going to create a pool of unhappy, low status men who don't have much time in the mating markets. And one way this has emerged in across societies actually, but heavily in the United States and Canada, are these incel communities of men who are online, very anti women, sometimes threatening violence, often, at least in terms of their verbiage, suicidal. So it's a
Hmm.
potential societal problem. It's even bigger in places like Korea, South Korea,
Yeah, I've
because
heard.
there women are even avoiding marriage more than they are in places like the US and Canada and Europe because the marriage system is still patriarchal. So more women are opting out, and that means you're getting a really big pool of low status unmarried men who are
Hmm.
dissatisfied.
And I mean, using history as a guide, what are some of the plausible outcomes of just letting that run through? So, for example, if you look at polygynous cultures in the past, what tends to happen to them as they scale up, or we just wait
Well,
longer?
violent uprising, mayhem, rising crime rates, not very much good stuff. I mean, Machiavellian political leaders will sometimes use, institute a draft and then use those guys to take over territory, right? And I mean that's why in former times, the reason to join the military was the raping and pillaging part,
Mm.
because that's how you paid your
Wow.
army.
So you had the guys who couldn't get online dates, so to speak. They were frustrated, and you could channel that frustration into, say, a military force that could acquire new territory.
Right, or it could be raiding. So lots of human societies would raid other societies and they'd come back with females, right? They come back with female spoils. This is throughout the ethnographic record. Now, I'm not worried that's going to happen in the modern world, but you see something more like robots. And of course, pornography is already there, but that's only going to get more virtual reality. The robots are only going to get better. So that's one direction.
Interesting, interesting. And so, I guess, sort of tie some of these things together. One of the ways that weird countries dealt with that problem is they established norms around monogamy and marriage and things like this that helped distribute reproductive success across the population. It's helped minimize the number of people that were not paired with someone, and it probably had a mitigating force against these types of uprisings and just large
Right, right.
swaths of society
And,
that
and Yeah, crime. Because you can think about it as, when a male has a mate and a child, then they have a stake in the future. And this totally changes their temporal
yeah.
discounting. Because now they got to be around to take care of that kid for 20 years. And they have progeny, so they want the future world to be, a good place for that progeny to live. But before that point, they just got to get into the mating market. And it doesn't matter until they're in the mating market what the future looks like.
Hmm. I suppose this is why maybe one way of saying this is, when we've in my lifetime we've seen this proliferation of things like school shootings, and they've become more frequent. But one thing that's hard to ignore is it's never the captain of the football team that's the perpetrator.
Right. And often it's, I mean, there are actual videotapes of, I mean, the Santa Barbara shooter actually basically explained what I just explained about the logic. He was jilted by women. He couldn't get in the marriage and mating market. And so that's frequently the case.
Hmm. What what are your thoughts on the evolution of religion moving forward? So, obviously, to some extent, I mean, all of the sort of classic traditional religions are still with us in some way, shape, or form. There's obviously still mutation and evolution happening. I think you can point to different sort of nominally secular movements in the modern world, and actually, they are religious in essence, even though they sort of strip themselves of the overtly religious ornamentation that maybe their precursors had. There's also seems to be maybe new religions sprouting up. People are really religion has always been concerned about the afterlife and death and immortality, and I think we're seeing that spring up in new ways that are nominally secular. I'm just wondering what your basic thoughts are on the evolution of religion moving forward, and some of the things that successful religions will need to have in order to gain adherence and become stable over time.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I feel like it's the Wild West because there's resurgence of old ideas. So, things like witchcraft and spells seem to be making a comeback.
Yeah.
Astrology is making a comeback. And I feel like a lot of the modern world, at least in the US and other um, successful liberal democracies, have offered people almost too much choice. So I feel like religions in the future are going to give people more prescribed pathways. They're certainly going to be pro-fertility. So one of the things that we're seeing is a big decline in fertility in a lot of populations. And this has been one of the secrets of religion's success, is to get people to have more babies than the
Mhm.
non-believers. So Christianity spreads in the early Roman Empire, in part through high fertility of Christian women. And then Mormonism spreads in the 19th century through high fertility of Mormon women. So if you can create environments that foster having lots of babies, even if people are partially doing it in the service of God, but they also have a community around them that's supportive of that, that can really lead to the spread of religions.
Hmm. So do you think when you look at sort of the major players that are out there spreading and competing today, different versions of Christianity, Islam, and so forth, looking at the historical record, is it likely that these things will sort of intermix and hybridize, or is the story of history more about competition and replacement, or displacement of one religion by another?
Yeah, I think there's always hybridization. Syncretism is there's actually a word specifically for it when it applies to religion. So, for example, lots of Americans have adopted Buddhist practices when it comes to meditation. And I think
Yeah.
that's going to find its way into lots of religious rituals that actually will trace back to Central Asia, but it'll find its way into new versions of Christianity and things like that.
Mhm. Um, Another thing that a lot of people are talking about and very much concerned with today is sort of the health of our institutions and whether or not they're actually serving the function for the society that they're supposed to. So I think it was Clay Shirky who came up with a principle. I think it's something like institutions will tend to perpetuate the problems for which they are the prescription. What do you think about that idea, and what causes institutions to become dysfunctional? There's many possible examples we could point to here, but I'll just put it that way to start.
Well, there's lots of reasons why institutions become dysfunctional. One is that the conditions of the world they were first evolved in have changed, and there
Mm,
can be lots of ways they changed. The other thing to remember is that there's always actors, self-interested actors,
yeah.
politically motivated actors who are looking to get around the institution or short-circuit it. And the institution, if it has any lasting robusticity, will resist that, will be built to resist that. But eventually they figure out how to beat it, right? So one of the things that I've thought about, and that this is a kind of a lesson from history, is that you should design your institutions a little bit like the immune system, where a specific organization designed to do a job like the Department of Defense, it should have a time tag on it so that you eventually put it aside as a dead cell, and you've hopefully started a new cell that's supposed to do the same job, but it's completely rebuilt from the ground up with none of the old problems of the first one. So you need some kind of, think of it like a body where you got to rejuvenate the cells every now and then. The problem is we put an institution in place that's supposed to do a job, the IRS, and then it just sits there forever. And people figure out ways to manipulate it, get around it, weaken it. And what you need to do is just throw and get a new thing that does the same job. Now, of course, that's easier said than done, but it's the only way I can think of that you're going to deal with the inevitable corrosion of at least parts of institutions.
Yeah. And so if that corrosion is inevitable, and it seems like it is, I think if we take that biological analogy seriously, then the way that institutions get better is not by sort of necessarily fixing the old decrepit cell, but actually by replacing it with a brand new one, and then getting rid of the old one.
That's right. And so, just at a practical level, there have to be institutions like this would have, say, the new institution would have a 30-year time tag. But then at some point, you got to start building the new one up so it's ready to take over when you take the first one offline, because you can't just have a period with no Department of Defense, right? So there's a little bit of complexity in getting the new cell online while the old one is kind of being phased out.
Mhm. And so I guess, if we sort of riff on the Shirky principle idea, the reason that an institution would eventually come to perpetuate the problem it's the solution for would be that it's probably been infiltrated by self-interested individuals who just want to,
Yeah.
keep
So
some money train
one of the
running.
reasons that can happen with that principle is that the individuals most motivated to get around the institution are going to be working on ways to short circuit it or get around it. And so sometimes it can actually
Mhm.
be harnessed to do exactly the thing it's supposed to be
Mhm.
stopping.
Are there any sort of norms or cultural practices in history that you can point to for how people dealt with that kind of problem? I would imagine that one general way this you might start to think about this is we might talk about things like term limits or how frequently you cycle people into different positions. Has that been any kind of common motif in history?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, and in fact, the selection of politicians has sometimes been random, like
Hmm.
literally drawing lots is the old Greek solution.
Hmm.
Now, you don't just let everyone draw lots. You have some qualified group of people, and then they draw a lot. And it's just a way of giving everybody a chance. Nobody has a long term. Nobody can consolidate power. Your ability to get into power, because I think what the Greeks were worried about was that you could use your power, connections, family, and manipulate the system so you got into power if it was an election. But if we're just picking lots, then it's going to be random, and we're going to do it again, in 2 years or whatever. Uh, so anything to kind of turn over the power structure, I think, is very useful.
Mhm. Are there when you think about weird cultures today and people who were born into and raised inside of them, are there any sort of psychological problems they're particularly predisposed to? And sort of knowing everything you know about the past and the present, what would be some of the ways that people might mitigate that?
Um, I think so. You're saying psychological problems that weird people
So
have.
people who have this weird mindset, they're very individualistic, they're very atomized, they're maybe sort of not connected to kin in the way that most people in other cultures and other times in history are. I would imagine that's going to leave them open to certain types of psychological maladies. And I'm
Yeah,
wondering if there's any way we can think about how you deal with that today.
right. Well, I think the main one, I mean, the main one that just goes back to the discussion of Protestantism would be things like loneliness, social dislocation, suicide, the kind of, I'm alone in the world and why I'm, no reason to live, so sense of meaning. And a big one is to figure out ways to get sense of meaning. So we talked about religion a lot. That's one thing that religions do well, right? They endow people with a sense of meaning.
Mhm.
There's plenty of secular ways to have a sense of meaning too. So that's something to look for, is to have a sense of meaning. And the other one is to spend, people can be very decisive or very focused on how they allocate time. You should always be allocating time towards building social relationships, especially if you're away from family. You should put time into spending time with friends, getting together, all that kind of thing. Because it's really the social bonds are one of the main things that make humans happy.
Mhm. Why have we seen sort of a disintegration over time of the things that used to facilitate that, even in Western culture? There's lots you can point to here, but there's people are just forming fewer clubs than they used to, right? There's fewer bowling leagues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, what you just said is perfectly intuitive. I think, it's not really shocking for anyone to hear, like, yeah, you should foster social relationships. And yet, for some reason, people don't seem to be doing it as much. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't studied this, but some things that come to mind are one, high rates of residential mobility
Mhm.
can influence this. And I also think that war shocks relate to this. So the generation that many people think about when they think about all these kind of the bowling alone type stuff, the bowling clubs, was the post-World War II generation. And
Mm.
we know that wars have a big effect on bonding among people. So the post-World War generation, World War II generation was quite bonded. And the Korean War and the Vietnam War, I'm thinking here of the US, didn't have those same sorts of bonding effects. And so it's almost like you can see this in our politics. The bonds that were created by the World War II shock, there's no one really around left with those bonds. So it's going to decay some of the institutions along with the social mobility and the emphasis on work and all those kinds of things.
Hmm. Interesting. Um,
Breakdown of religious community. So more recently, the U.S. has become less religious, and one of the
yeah.
main ways that people have these social groups is through their religions.
Mhm, mhm. And I want to ask you about universities as an institution, given what you study, but also because you're a part of one. You're really embedded in the university system. How have sort of the form and function of universities changed? Even since the Middle Ages, then till now. And would you characterize the universities as being sort of relatively healthy or relatively unhealthy today?
Well, they're certainly going through they're going through this concern with political correctness and wokeism and whatnot, and this reduction in free speech. I think in the long run, that's going to turn out to have been more of a blip.
Hmm.
So at Harvard, I'm involved with this Council of Academic Freedom, and it seems to be a very energetic group that is really pushing to make sure that there is full freedom of speech, which is really at the core of the university mission. I mean, we can't do our stuff without that. I think it's not as bad, at least as people often think. So, for example, you made reference to that paper by David Reich and Akbari. I mean, that's a pretty controversial paper that makes a controversial claim with lots of good evidence. Uh, and that people got excited about it and are taking it seriously and are researching it. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing we want is people to take these ideas seriously. There was a lot of stuff going on around gender and whatnot. And I feel like, we're kind of returning to equilibrium where we can discuss and debate these issues without just calling each other names.
I see. So you're hopeful in that sense. You think
I
we're
am. I
returning to
am.
equilibrium.
I think we're over the hump, and we're maybe going to a better equilibrium where we can restore and maybe even improve uh, the ability to engage in controversial issues in respectful and productive ways. But there was definitely a bad period.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. What are some of the things that you're working on today? What are the research questions that you're interested in that you think you're excited about that maybe we'll see some new work come out in the next couple years or so?
Yeah. So one of my big things now is uh, building on some of the ideas in weird, I'm interested in really digging into this idea of the collective brain. So,
Hmm.
what drives human creativity and innovation? And I mean, three factors that come out of the theoretical work on this are the size of the population, the cognitive diversity in the population, the social interconnectedness. So I've been trying to review all the available evidence, for example, looking at how prohibition reduced the creativity of American populations because they couldn't meet in the bar and swap ideas, right?
Mm.
So that's kind of an unexpected effect. You would think getting people not to drink might improve their creativity, but it actually reduced it because it's really the collective brain that does a lot of the work. How things like railroads really increased creativity because ideas could flow more easily among places. So, and I want to look at this over human history. And so we've using natural language processing methods. We have some ideas and we've begun to turn the wheel on measuring the creativity of texts. And with text, we can go back into history in places like China and in Latin Europe and in Persia using Farsi. And then we can see how creativity changed over time and space.
Hmm. And what sort of methods do you employ? Are you doing mostly research where it's computer work and analysis, or are you still doing things like field work?
The lab's pretty diverse in terms of what we're up to. I have been doing two things field-wise. So I'm involved with some of my former postdocs in a project in Namibia. So we're studying populations in northern Namibia and southern Angola. And we're interested in many things, but one of the things we're interested in is the effect of schools on cognitive development. So it's a natural experiment there where we have some communities of herders that have schools and some that don't, and they vary in how long they've had the schools. And we have some natural barriers, like the river that runs between Angola and Namibia, that mean there's schools on one side and not schools on the other side. So that allows us to compare the same ethnic group and look at the effect. And then we give kids cognitive tests at different ages. And this can allow us to assess the effect of schools on cognition, things like IQ, fluid intelligence, memory, executive function, stuff like that. And schools have huge effects on this. And they have
Mhm.
effects on the kids even before the kids would go to school. And we think it's because it affects the larger community. So if you grow up in a world of schooled individuals, you're already different before you go to school. Um,
um, based on your book, based on the things that we've discussed today, what are some things that you think maybe people should keep in mind? You know, if we're in a weird country and we're in this part of the world and we've been in it, what are some things people should keep in mind about? I don't know, maybe sort of the value of weird cultures and the things that we should be mindful of when we're thinking about sort of replacing or getting rid of institutions that have been around a lot longer than an individual lifetime. One of the things that comes up almost as a theme in your book, just when you're studying cultural anthropology in general, is again, people as individuals don't usually recognize exactly why the institutions are there and how they work and what they're doing for them.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that comes out in many different ways in my work is that we have these cultural practices that might seem silly or outdated, and that may in fact be the case, right? So I'm not saying that everything is hunky dory and it's a Panglossian world, but it's worth making sure you understand what this cultural thing evolved for, even if people themselves don't understand it. So in Fiji, I did this work in these remote islands in Fiji, and one of the things I found is that women had a set of food taboos when they would get pregnant and during breastfeeding. And it turned out that the taboos protected the fetus and then later the nursing infant from dangerous marine toxins. So reef fish eat a certain marine dinoflagellate, which turns into a toxin. And many of the people will carry subclinical levels of the toxin in their bloodstream because they're eating reef fish all the time.
Mhm.
But babies aren't ready for this yet. So the taboos protect the women. So the doctors don't know much about this, and they could have told the women to forget the taboos, but then they would have been poisoning the fetuses because medical science doesn't know much about populations living on reef fish.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's a simple case. And then something more complicated would be the monogamy thing we've been talking about. So I was involved in this court case where I was brought in to inform the Chief Justice in British Columbia province in Canada about the history of polygyny and monogamy. And most people's reaction was, oh, this monogamy, that's just like this old-fashioned Victorian thing or something. We don't need it anymore. People can just make decisions. And I was like making the case, well, maybe we want to do that. But before we do that, we should understand about the distribution of males and females and how, you could end up with this situation where the elite men have all the women or the women are just lost interest in the low status men. And then we're going to have a problem and we got to deal with that. So I think it's always good to, sort through this just so you know the real costs and benefits of your policy decisions.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, I mean, that problem in particular, I mean, this is certainly not the first discussion had on it, but, that's not really a theoretical problem at this point. It's a very real problem. I think, as you mentioned, you got something like half the men trying to get dates on the dating apps can't even get a like. What are the reasonable avenues by which this problem has been dealt with in the past, other than hopefully not all you have to say is,
Well,
we ship them off to war.
monogamy was one way it was dealt with in the past.
Mm.
The other ways that I can think of are all ones we don't want to do.
Yeah, yeah. So
They
maybe
involve using the low status men for conflict and conquest and things like that.
right. So if we want to avoid that, I guess one possible idea would be thinking seriously about reinvigorating sort of the value that the culture places on things like monogamy.
Yeah, there's that. And the other thing that plays a role in here is I mean, you can think about everybody's inequality, but it's particularly relevant male inequality. So you can mitigate that problem if you reduce the inequality between males. And, like our society, for example, CEOs get paid way more than CEOs get paid in Europe, which means
Mhm.
the inequality in the US is much steeper than we find in other
Mm, right.
similar
And so that
countries.
will naturally focus female attention more
Right.
strongly.
So that drives it, anything that increases the amount of inequality is going to make the problem worse. So you could mitigate the problem just by, it's still inequality, but it's just less dramatic, right?
Mhm. Interesting, interesting. And maybe one last thing we'll briefly discuss is, and it's related to I think what we just talked about, the fertility issues that people are starting to talk about more and more. Many countries, especially the weird countries, and weird influenced countries like South Korea, as you mentioned previously, they have very low fertility rates, very much below replacement rate. And one of the things that's hard to grok for people when it comes to this stuff is that these things can change very dramatically, very suddenly on just a 1 or 2 generation scale. And even though we don't have an intuition for population collapse, it can and does happen in history. What do you think about the fertility issue and what the possible solutions to that might look like?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. One of the so one, I mean, what we know from some work in my field is that the things that could increase fertility are religious commitments and having family around.
Mm-hmm.
So both of those are not really the direction society is heading, So people seem to be more willing to have more children if they're surrounded by lots of family. I think that's because it helps with alloparents and playmates and things like that. Uh, yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
I'm not. I just feel like religions are going to take over and do what they've done in the past, which is create situations where there's high fertility.
Yeah. Is
But
that tied into why we see um, recurrent religious revivals, both in U.S. history and history more broadly?
yeah, I mean, it certainly does pop up in lots of places. So if you think about the Second Great Revival in the early 19th century, you get Mormonism out of that, and you get a few other high fertility religions, like you get um, it'll come to me. There's a couple other still surviving religions from them. Of course, evangelical Protestants, religion in general leads to higher fertility, but there's variation among different religions. It's interesting. There were, I mean, not Caesar, Augustus, Caesar Augustus was worried about this problem. He had demographic decline too, and so he started instituting laws to promote the family. So this is definitely not the first time around for this problem. And one of the things that seems to have solved the problem is Christianity. The Christians just outpopulated the Romans.
Yeah, I wonder if, others I've talked to have drawn an analogy between the present moment and what some people call the axial age. And I'm not an expert in this, but the basic idea is this was a period in which a lot of new religions popped up, some of which are still with us today and some of which are no longer with us. And, there was basically changes in social network graphs and how people were relating that had to do with things like the adoption of currencies. So the way people related changed, and this led to sort of just a crisis of meaning that then prompted new religions to spring up. And then obviously the ones that were the best at getting into people's minds and promoting reproduction are the ones that are largely still with us today. Some people have speculated that maybe we're in a similar situation today. There's differences in currency and inflation issues. Obviously, there's this sort of widespread lack of pair bonding that's happening for a lot of people, and maybe this will prompt some kind of new religions to crop up.
Yeah, I mean, that fits with what we were discussing earlier, where I see a lot of different elements circulating. I'm not sure I've seen uh, particularly new religions, but I feel like there's a lot going on. Like I said, it
Yeah,
was the Wild West, so
yeah.
there's a lot of things to recombine. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't be sure, but my spidey sense is telling me that we might be seeing some of these things in embryo. When you look at some of the changes, and I mean, obviously, you could argue that some of the AI people, that are more have the singularity mindset and the live forever mindset. This might be tied into religious impulses. Even health influencers that are now talking seriously and specifically about immortality and actually living forever. I could easily see these becoming sort of the basis for the new spiritual movements or something.
Yeah, no, and the singularity is a classic millenarian movement. Sorry about my phone. Uh, yeah, so I see those same elements too. We'll see how they crystallize to form new movements in general.
Any final thoughts you want to leave people with, or anything you want to reiterate to tie the discussion together?
Well, just that there's so much we can learn from history. And one of the main things I've been working on, we were talking about my interest in innovation and creativity, is just how psychology has co-evolved with our institutions and our ways of life. So it's easy to think if you grow up at a certain time in history that this is just how humans are and how they think. But
Mm-hmm.
what we're seeing when we look back in time, especially using these new methods, is that there's really been a lot of change in how people think about the future and their personality and the structure of personalities and their willingness to engage in analytic thinking in just a lot of different areas.
All right. Well, Professor Joe Henrich, thank you very much for your time. Highly recommend your book. I don't know. Do you have a website or anywhere you want to point people
Yeah, if
or
you Google me, I have websites for the book and myself, and
all right. Well, yeah, once again, thank you very much for your time. Fascinating stuff.
good to be with you.